Hello and welcome. If you enjoy calm stories like this, tap like and subscribe for a new one each day. Let's begin. Part I: The Echo of the Guns. Once upon a time, in a world not so very different from our own, a great and terrible storm had just passed. This storm was called the Second World War, and it had raged for 6 long years, from 1939 to 1945. It was a war that had touched every corner of the globe, a fire that had consumed cities, toppled kingdoms, and left behind a silence filled with sorrow. Imagine a vast and beautiful garden, a garden named Europe. For centuries, this garden had been a place of wondrous things, of soaring cathedrals and brilliant art, of thinkers who dreamed of new worlds and musicians who wrote melodies that could make you weep. But the great storm had torn through this garden, leaving it scarred and broken. The grand old trees were splintered, the flower beds were trampled into mud, and the once proud fountains lay in ruins. In the year 1945, the guns finally fell silent. A deep collective sigh of relief rippled across the continents. The storm was over. The people who had survived crept out from their shelters, blinking in the new quiet sunlight. They looked at the rubble of their homes, at the empty chairs at their dinner tables, and they felt a mixture of profound relief and bone-deep weariness. They had won. The great evil of Nazism, a darkness that had threatened to swallow the world, had been defeated. The victors were a group of nations who called themselves the Allies. The three most powerful among them were the United States, a young and mighty country across the Atlantic Ocean, the United Kingdom, an old and resilient island kingdom, and the Soviet Union, a vast and enigmatic land that stretched across 2 continents. They had been unlikely friends, brought together by a common enemy. The United States and the United Kingdom believed in freedom, in the right of people to choose their own leaders and speak their own minds. The Soviet Union was a communist state, ruled by a powerful dictator named Joseph Stalin, where the government controlled everything and individual freedoms were a distant dream. But during the war, these differences had been set aside. They had fought together, bled together, and now they celebrated together. Their leaders, President Harry S. Truman of the United States, Prime Minister Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, and Premier Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union met in a German city called Potsdam. They sat around a large table, tired men who held the fate of the world in their hands. Their task was to decide what to do with the broken garden of Europe. How could they mend it? How could they make sure such a terrible storm would never happen again? They made plans to rebuild Germany, the country where the storm had begun. They drew new lines on maps, creating new borders for countries that had been stretched and torn. They promised to bring the criminals of the war to justice. There was a feeling, fragile yet real, of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this time they could build a lasting peace. But even as they spoke of peace, a chill was beginning to creep into the air. The friendship between the Allies, born of necessity, was starting to fray. The world, you see, was not a simple place of good and evil. It was a complex tapestry of different ideas, different dreams, and different fears. The United States, with its great factories untouched by the war, was now the richest and most powerful nation on earth. It had a new and terrible weapon, the atomic bomb, a power so immense it could turn a city to dust in the blink of an eye. The Americans looked at the devastation in Europe and felt a sense of responsibility. They wanted to help rebuild, to spread their ideals of democracy and free trade. They believed that if countries were prosperous and free, they would be less likely to start wars. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had suffered immensely in the war. Millions of its people had perished, and its lands were scarred. Stalin, a man whose heart was a fortress of suspicion, looked at the world with wary eyes. He was determined to protect his country from another invasion. He believed the only way to be safe was to be surrounded by friendly, obedient neighbors. He had a vast army, the Red Army, which had marched all the way to Berlin, the heart of Germany. And where the Red Army stood, it did not leave. So, as the soldiers of America and Britain began to pack their bags and sail for home, the soldiers of the Red Army stayed. They remained in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, in Bulgaria, and in the eastern part of Germany. Stalin had promised that these countries would have free elections, that their people could choose their own destinies, but this promise was like a whisper in the wind. Slowly, methodically, the Soviet Union began to extend its control. One by one, the countries of Eastern Europe found their governments taken over by communists who were loyal to Moscow. Newspapers that criticized the new rulers were shut down. Political leaders who spoke of democracy were arrested or forced to flee. It was as if a great, heavy curtain was being drawn across the middle of Europe, separating the East from the West. Winston Churchill, who was no longer prime minister, but was still a powerful voice, traveled to America in 1946. In a small college town in Missouri, he gave a speech that would echo around the world. He said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." An iron curtain. The phrase was stark and terrifying. It painted a picture of a Europe divided, not by mountains or rivers, but by an invisible wall of ideology and fear. On one side of the curtain were the countries of Western Europe, struggling to rebuild their democracies, their economies in tatters. On the other side was the Soviet bloc, a collection of nations whose fates were now tied to the will of one man in the Kremlin. The hope that had flickered in 1945 began to dim. The world had not found a lasting peace. Instead, it had stumbled into a new kind of conflict. It was not a hot war, with armies clashing and bombs falling. It was a cold war, a war of ideas, of espionage, of propaganda, and of nerve-wracking tension. The two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, the elephant and the whale, eyed each other from a distance, each convinced that the other sought to dominate the world. The people of Western Europe, who had just survived one nightmare, now found themselves living in the shadow of another. They were exhausted and impoverished. Their armies were a fraction of their former size. And just across the new invisible border, the mighty Red Army stood, a constant, looming threat. They looked across the Atlantic to their powerful friend, the United States, and they wondered, are we alone? If the shadow in the east decides to move, who will protect us? This was the question that hung in the air in the years after the great storm. It was a question born of fear and uncertainty, and the answer to that question would be a new idea, a promise, a shield. It would be an alliance unlike any the world had ever seen. It would be called NATO. But before the shield could be forged, the world had to get colder and the shadows had to grow longer. Part 2. The shadow lengthens. As the first few years after the war slipped by, the Iron Curtain that Churchill had spoken of seemed to become more solid, more real with each passing day. The world was holding its breath, watching the two new superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, as they circled each other like wary predators. This was the Cold War, and it was a war fought not on battlefields, but in the minds of men and women, in whispered conversations in quiet capitals, and in the stark headlines of newspapers. In the East, behind the curtain, Stalin was playing a grim game he called salami tactics. Imagine a long sausage, a salami. If you try to grab the whole thing at once, someone might stop you. But if you slice it, piece by piece, so thin that no one notices, you can have the whole sausage before anyone realizes what has happened. This is what Stalin did with the nations of Eastern Europe. In Poland, the free elections that had been promised never truly came. In Hungary, the Communist Party, with the backing of the Red Army, slowly squeezed all other parties out of existence. In Romania and Bulgaria, the story was the same. The process was slow, almost invisible from a distance. A non-communist politician would be accused of a crime he didn't commit. A newspaper would be shut down for printing lies. A youth group would be persuaded to merge with a communist one. Slice by slice, the freedom of these nations was carved away. The final, most shocking slice came in 1948, in a country called Czechoslovakia. This was a nation with a proud democratic tradition, a little island of freedom that had somehow survived between the great powers. But in February of that year, the communists, with the quiet threat of Soviet force behind them, staged a coup. The democratic government was overthrown. The foreign minister, a man named Jan Masaryk, a symbol of his country's hopes, was found dead in the courtyard of his ministry, having fallen from a window. Whether he jumped or was pushed, no one knew for sure, but his death felt like the death of democracy itself in Eastern Europe. The news from Czechoslovakia sent a shock wave of fear through the West. It was no longer possible to pretend that Stalin's ambitions were limited. He was not just securing his borders, he was expanding his empire. The salami was being sliced, and it seemed that all of Europe might be on the menu. In Washington, President Truman watched these events with growing alarm. He was a plain-spoken man from Missouri, not a grand strategist like Churchill, but he had a core of steel. He believed that the spread of communism was like a disease, and if it was not contained, it would infect the whole world. This belief became known as the Truman Doctrine. It began in a place that seemed far from the heart of Europe, Greece and Turkey. In Greece, a bitter civil war was raging between the government and communist rebels. In Turkey, Stalin was putting immense pressure on the government, demanding control of the strategic waterways that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Great Britain, which had traditionally been the protector of this region, was now exhausted and broke from the war. The British sent a quiet message to Washington: "We can no longer afford to help. The torch must be passed." Truman went before the American Congress and made a momentous speech. He declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. He asked for a huge sum of money, $400 million, to provide military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. This was a revolutionary moment. For most of its history, America had followed the advice of its first president, George Washington, to avoid entangling alliances. It had seen the problems of Europe as Europe's problems. Now, Truman was saying that America's own peace and security depended on the freedom of people thousands of miles away. Congress agreed, and the aid began to flow. The Truman Doctrine was a line drawn in the sand. America was no longer just an observer. It was a participant in the struggle for Europe's future. But Truman and his advisors knew that guns and soldiers were not enough. A hungry man is not interested in the fine points of democracy. He is interested in bread. A man whose children are cold is not concerned with freedom of speech. He is concerned with finding fuel for his fire. The economies of Western Europe were in a desperate state. Factories were silent, fields were barren, and people were losing hope. And where there is despair, the promises of communism, of a radical new order, can sound very tempting. Communist parties were gaining strength in countries like France and Italy. The man who saw this most clearly was Truman's new Secretary of State, George C. Marshall. Marshall was a man of quiet dignity and immense prestige. He had been the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during the war, the architect of victory. He was not a man given to flowery speeches. In June 1947, he went to Harvard University to receive an honorary degree. In his short address, he laid out an idea that would change the course of history. He spoke of the economic chaos in Europe. He said it was not just a humanitarian crisis, but a threat to world peace. He proposed a plan, not of charity, but of partnership. He suggested that the countries of Europe should get together, figure out what they needed to rebuild, and create a joint plan for recovery. If they did that, he said, the United States would provide the financial help to make it happen. This was the Marshall Plan. It was a breathtakingly ambitious idea. It was an offer not just to America's friends, but to all of Europe, including the Soviet Union and the countries behind the Iron Curtain. For a moment, there was a flicker of hope. Could this be a way to bridge the divide, to heal the whole Garden of Europe together? The foreign ministers of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union met in Paris to discuss the offer. The British and the French were enthusiastic. This was the lifeline they had been praying for. But the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, was deeply suspicious. He saw the Marshall Plan as a trick, a dollar trap, designed to make Europe dependent on America and to undermine communism. After a few tense days, he walked out of the meeting. The answer from Moscow was a firm niet, and the countries of Eastern Europe, whatever their own people might have wanted, were forced to say no as well. The Marshall Plan went ahead without them. Over the next 4 years, the United States would pour an incredible $13 billion, the equivalent of over $150 billion today, into Western Europe. The money was used to rebuild factories, repair railways, modernize farms, and stabilize currencies. It was a staggering act of generosity, but it was also an act of enlightened self-interest. As the economies of Western Europe began to recover, the appeal of communism faded. Hope began to return. The shops began to fill with goods, the chimneys began to smoke, and the sounds of construction replaced the silence of despair. The Marshall Plan was a great success. It helped to save Western Europe from economic collapse, but it also solidified the division of the continent. The Iron Curtain now had an economic dimension. In the West, there was the Marshall Plan Europe, growing more prosperous and tied to America. In the East, there was the Soviet bloc, following a different path of state-controlled economies. The shadow was still there. In fact, in some ways, it was darker than ever. The events in Czechoslovakia had shown that Stalin was willing to use force to get his way. The success of the Marshall Plan had angered him. He saw a prosperous, confident Western Europe as a threat to his own empire. He needed to show the West that he was still the master of Central Europe, that he could still call the shots. He needed to test their resolve, and he chose to do it in the one place where East and West met face to face, a city that was a symbol of the divided world, Berlin. Part 3. The City of No Escape. In the heart of Soviet-controlled East Germany lay a city that was a paradox, an island of the West in a sea of the East. This city was Berlin. After the war, just as Germany itself had been divided among the four victorious Allies, so too had its capital. The Soviet Union controlled the eastern part of the city. The western part was divided into three sectors, controlled by the United States, Great Britain, and France. West Berlin was a strange and vibrant place. It was a beacon of freedom and capitalism deep inside the communist world. You could drive for 100 miles through the drab, controlled landscape of East Germany, and then suddenly you would be in a place with bright lights, bustling shops, and newspapers that said whatever they pleased. For Stalin, West Berlin was a bone in his throat. It was a constant, irritating reminder of the world he could not control, a window through which his own people could glimpse a different way of life. In the spring of 1948, the Western powers decided to take a crucial step to help Germany recover. They announced that they would be creating a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, for their zones of occupation, including West Berlin. This was a sensible economic move, designed to curb inflation and stimulate the economy. But Stalin saw it as an act of aggression. He saw it as the West creating a separate, prosperous West German state, a state that he feared would one day rearm and threaten him. He decided that the time had come to squeeze the West out of Berlin for good. On June 24, 1948, the trap was sprung. The Soviet authorities announced that, due to technical difficulties, all road, rail, and canal traffic into West Berlin from the west would be halted. The Iron Curtain had become a physical blockade. The 2 million people of West Berlin, along with the small garrisons of American, British, and French soldiers, were cut off. They were surrounded, a tiny island of democracy in a vast red ocean. Stalin's plan was simple and cruel. He would starve the city into submission. West Berlin had only enough food for about a month and enough coal for its power plants for a little longer. Sooner or later, the people would be cold and hungry. The Western powers would be faced with a terrible choice: either abandon the city and suffer a humiliating defeat in the first major confrontation of the Cold War, or try to force their way through the blockade on the ground, an act that would almost certainly mean war. Stalin was betting that they would not risk war. He was betting that they would back down. In Washington, London, and Paris, the news was received with shock and dread. The military governor of the American zone in Germany, General Lucius D. Clay, was a tough and determined soldier. His first instinct was to send an armored column driving down the highway to Berlin. "They can't stop us," he argued. But President Truman and his advisors in Washington were more cautious. They knew that the Red Army had hundreds of thousands of soldiers in East Germany. A single shot could escalate into a full-blown war, a war that could quickly become nuclear. The world had just escaped one inferno. It could not afford to plunge into another. The situation seemed hopeless. The city was sealed. The land routes were blocked. But then, an idea began to take shape, an idea so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that at first it was dismissed as a fantasy. If they could not get to Berlin by land, could they get to it by air? There were 3 narrow air corridors into Berlin that had been guaranteed by a written agreement with the Soviets. Stalin, in his haste to close the land routes, had either forgotten about them or believed they were irrelevant. How could you supply a city of 2 million people from the air? It would take a miracle. The man who believed the miracle was possible was Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary. Bevin was a former trade union leader, a big, gruff man with a powerful sense of justice. He saw the blockade as a simple act of bullying, and he was determined not to give in. "If we let Berlin go," he said, "West Germany will be next. We've got to stand firm." He urged the Americans to consider an airlift. General Clay in Berlin was skeptical at first, but he was willing to try anything. The Americans had transport planes, the C-47s, known as sky trains, and the British had their own. The airlift began as a small, desperate gamble. On June 26th, just 2 days after the blockade began, the first American planes landed at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, loaded with powdered milk and flour. The first few days were a struggle. The planes were too small, the weather was bad, and the logistics were a nightmare. The Soviets scoffed. They called it a futile gesture. But the gesture did not stop. In fact, it grew. President Truman, seeing the determination of the Berliners and his own people on the ground, made a fateful decision. He ordered a massive expansion of the airlift. He sent for General William H. Tunner, the man who had masterminded the hump airlift over the Himalayas to supply China during the war. Tunner was a genius of logistics. He arrived in Germany and transformed the operation. He demanded bigger planes, the new 4-engine C-54 Skymasters. He created a system of clockwork precision. The planes flew in a constant stream, one after another, landing, unloading their cargo in minutes, and taking off again. Everything was timed to the second. The air corridors became one-way streets, with planes flying in on one level and out on another. It was a conveyor belt in the sky. The people of West Berlin watched this spectacle with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The constant drone of the planes, which at first was a nuisance, became a sound of hope. It was the sound of freedom. The Berliners themselves played a crucial role. They worked day and night to help unload the planes and to build a new, bigger airport at Tegel, using rubble from the bombed-out city as its foundations. They endured a harsh winter with little food and fuel, but their morale did not break. They were united in their defiance. One of the most enduring images of the airlift came from an American pilot named Gale Halverson. He noticed children gathered by the fences of the airport watching the planes. He felt a pang of sympathy for them. On an impulse, he took some chocolate bars from his rations, tied them to little handkerchief parachutes, and dropped them to the children as he came in to land. The next day, more children were waiting. Halverson and his fellow pilots started doing it regularly. They became known as the Rosinenbomber, the Raisin Bombers. It was a small gesture, but it was a powerful symbol of the human connection that lay at the heart of the cold, geopolitical struggle. The airlift, which the Soviets had dismissed, became a staggering success. At its peak, a plane was landing in West Berlin every 30 seconds. The city was being supplied with thousands of tons of food, coal, and medicine every single day. The airlift was not just keeping the city alive, it was thriving. For Stalin, it was a humiliating spectacle. His great power play had backfired. He had tried to demonstrate his strength, and instead, he had revealed the West's ingenuity and resolve. He had tried to break the will of the Berliners, and instead, he had forged them into a symbol of courage for the entire world. He had hoped to divide the Western Allies, and instead, he had brought them closer together than ever before. Finally, in the spring of 1949, after nearly a year, Stalin admitted defeat. On May 12th, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade. The roads and railways were reopened. The first American truck convoy that drove into the city was met with cheering crowds. The crisis was over. The Berlin airlift was a great victory for the West. It was a victory won without firing a single shot, but it was also a terrifying wake-up call. It had brought the world to the brink of war. It had shown, in the starkest possible terms, that the shadow in the East was a real and present danger. The countries of Western Europe had been lucky this time, but what about next time? What if the next crisis involved not a blockade, but tanks rolling across the plains of Germany? The Truman Doctrine had offered American economic and military aid. The Marshall Plan had helped to rebuild their economies. The Berlin airlift had shown that America had the will to stand up to Soviet aggression. But these were all reactions to crises. They were not a permanent solution. The leaders of Western Europe knew they needed something more. They needed a guarantee. They needed a formal, binding promise that if the shadow moved, they would not stand alone. They needed a shield. And in the tense aftermath of the Berlin crisis, the work of forging that shield began in earnest. Part 4. The Promise in the Treaty. The Berlin airlift had been a triumph of resolve, but it left the leaders of Western Europe with a lingering sense of dread. They had stared into the abyss of a potential war, and they knew they had been fortunate. They could not rely on last-minute improvised solutions to keep them safe. They needed a more permanent arrangement, a solid promise they could count on. The idea of a defensive alliance was not new. In fact, a small-scale version already existed. In March 1948, even before the Berlin Blockade began, 5 countries, Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, signed the Treaty of Brussels. It was a pact of mutual defense. They promised that if any one of them was attacked, the others would come to their aid. It was a noble idea, but everyone knew it was a promise written on paper, not backed by real strength. These 5 nations, still recovering from the war, simply did not have the military power to stand up to the Soviet Union. Their alliance was like 5 small children agreeing to protect each other from a giant. What they needed was the giant's older brother to join their club. They needed the United States. The problem was that the United States had a long and deeply ingrained tradition of avoiding entangling alliances. The idea of promising in advance to go to war for a country in Europe was something that many Americans were deeply uncomfortable with. It seemed to go against the very grain of their history. The key figure in bridging this gap was a man who had once been a staunch isolationist himself, Senator Arthur H. Vandenberg. He was a Republican from the opposition party to President Truman's Democrats. But Vandenberg had seen the world change, and he had changed with it. He believed that the security of America was now inseparable from the security of Europe. He famously said that politics stops at the water's edge. In matters of national survival, there could be no room for partisan squabbling. Vandenberg worked with the Truman administration to craft a resolution that would be presented to the U.S. Senate. This, the Vandenberg resolution, was a masterpiece of careful wording. It didn't mention any specific treaty or alliance. Instead, it stated that the United States should pursue the progressive development of regional and other collective arrangements for individual and collective self-defense. It was a green light, a subtle but unmistakable signal that the United States was now willing to consider joining a defensive pact. The resolution passed the Senate by a huge margin in June 1948, right at the beginning of the Berlin Blockade. The door was now open. With this crucial backing, secret talks began in Washington in the summer of 1948. Representatives from the 5 Brussels Treaty powers, plus the United States and Canada, gathered to start hammering out the details of a new transatlantic alliance. These were serious men, meeting in the shadow of a global crisis. They knew they were not just writing a document, they were trying to build a dam to hold back the tide of history. The negotiations were not always easy. There were deep-seated fears and old rivalries to overcome. The French, who had been invaded by Germany 3 times in 70 years, were worried about a rearmed Germany. The smaller countries were worried that the big powers would dominate the alliance. And everyone was worried about the exact nature of the American commitment. The heart of the matter, the core of the entire enterprise, was the Article on Collective Defense. This would become the famous Article 5. The Europeans wanted this promise to be as automatic as possible. If a Soviet tank crossed the border into West Germany, they wanted to know for certain that this would mean war with the United States. They wanted a tripwire, a guarantee that an attack on one would be an attack on all, triggering an immediate and massive response. The Americans, however, had a constitutional problem. Under the U.S. Constitution, only Congress can declare war. The president could not make a treaty that would automatically commit the nation to war without a vote from the representatives of the people. The American negotiators, led by Secretary of State Dean Acheson, a sharp and elegant lawyer, had to find a way to make the promise strong enough to deter Stalin, but flexible enough to be acceptable to the U.S. Senate. The debate over the wording of Article 5 went on for weeks. It was the central drama of the negotiations. Finally, they arrived at a compromise, a sentence that was both powerful and nuanced. It said that if an ally were attacked, each member of the alliance would take necessary, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. As it deems necessary, those 4 words were the key. They meant that the response was not automatic. Each country would decide for itself what action to take, but the message was still clear. An attack on one would be considered an attack on all, and while the use of armed force was not guaranteed, it was explicitly mentioned as an option. It was a promise strong enough to be a credible deterrent, but flexible enough to pass the U.S. Senate. There was another important debate during the negotiations. Some of the negotiators, particularly the Canadian representative, Lester B. Pearson, wanted the new alliance to be more than just a military pact. They wanted it to be a community of nations bound by shared values of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. They pushed for an article that would encourage the members to cooperate on economic and political issues as well. This became Article 2, sometimes called the Canadian Article. It was a reminder that the alliance was not just about tanks and planes. It was about defending a whole way of life. By the spring of 1949, the work was done. The negotiators had a final text. They had created the North Atlantic Treaty. It was a remarkably short and simple document, only 14 articles long, but it contained a promise that would change the world. The invitation to join the new alliance was extended to several other countries that were strategically important: Italy, Portugal, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. Norway's decision was particularly significant. It shared a border with the Soviet Union, and Stalin put immense pressure on the Norwegians not to join. But the memory of the Nazi occupation was still fresh, and the Norwegians chose the protection of the West. On April 4th, 1949, a date that would go down in history, the foreign ministers of 12 nations gathered in a large auditorium in Washington, D.C. The flags of Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States stood together on the stage. One by one, the ministers walked to a large mahogany table and signed the treaty. President Truman watched over the ceremony. In his speech, he captured the spirit of the moment. He said the treaty was a shield against aggression, and the fear of aggression a bulwark which will permit us to get on with the real business of government and society, the business of achieving a fuller and happier life for all our citizens. He was making it clear that this was a defensive alliance. It was not aimed at conquering anyone. It was designed to prevent a war, not to start one. It was a shield, not a sword. When the signing was complete, a great cheer went up from the assembled crowd. The sound of a military band playing filled the hall. It was a moment of profound relief and quiet celebration. In a world full of shadows and fear, 12 nations had come together to light a candle. They had made a promise to each other, a promise to stand together, a promise that no one among them would ever have to stand alone again. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, had been born. Part V. The shield is tested. The signing of the North Atlantic Treaty was a momentous occasion, but a signature on a piece of paper is not the same as a shield of steel. The new alliance, NATO, existed in theory, but it had no soldiers, no generals, and no unified plan of action. It was a promise, but it was not yet a reality. The first Secretary General of NATO, a British general named Lord Eastmay, famously summarized the purpose of the new alliance in a blunt and memorable way: to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. The first part, keeping the Russians out, was the most immediate challenge. The second, keeping the Americans in, was what the treaty was all about, formalizing the U.S. commitment to Europe. The third part, keeping the Germans down, was a reflection of the deep-seated fear of a resurgent Germany. For now, West Germany was not a member of the alliance. It was still an occupied country. In its first year, NATO was little more than a political committee. The members would consult, they would plan, but they had no integrated military structure. The vast Red Army in Eastern Europe was still vastly superior to the small, scattered armies of the Western European nations. The real deterrent was not NATO's conventional forces, but the unspoken threat of America's atomic bomb. Then, in 1949, two events happened that sent a new jolt of fear through the West and forced NATO to become a real military alliance. First, in August, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb. The American nuclear monopoly was over. The world now had two nuclear powers, and the balance of terror had begun. Second, in October, the long civil war in China ended with a victory for the communist forces led by Mao Zedong. The most populous country on earth was now part of the communist bloc. It seemed to confirm the worst fears of the West, that communism was a monolithic global movement, directed from Moscow, advancing on all fronts. The final, decisive push came from a place far from Europe. On June 25, 1950, the Communist Army of North Korea, armed and trained by the Soviet Union, stormed across the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The Korean War had begun. For President Truman and the leaders of Europe, the invasion of South Korea was a terrifying echo of what could happen in Germany. They saw North Korea as a Soviet proxy, a puppet state doing Stalin's bidding. If the communists were willing to use open military force to expand their influence in Asia, what was to stop them from doing the same in Europe? The plains of North Germany looked flat and vulnerable, an easy route for Soviet tanks to roll to the English Channel. The Korean War galvanized NATO into action. The theoretical promise had to be turned into a practical defense. The members of the alliance realized they needed a unified command structure, a single general who could lead their combined forces in the event of a war. There was only one man who everyone agreed was right for the job: Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike, as he was known, had been the supreme Allied commander in Europe during World War II, the man who had led the day invasion. He was a figure of immense international prestige, respected and trusted on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1951, Eisenhower was recalled to active duty and became the first Supreme Allied Commander Europe, or CESUR. He set up his headquarters just outside of Paris, in a place called Rocancourt. The headquarters was given a suitably grand name: Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe, or SHAPE. The name was a message in itself. It was a symbol of unity, of power, and of a shared purpose. Under Eisenhower's leadership, the hard practical work of building a shield began. Soldiers from different countries had to learn to work together. They needed common procedures, common equipment, and a common language, which became English. American troops began to arrive in Europe in large numbers, not as occupiers, but as allies, stationed on the front line of the Cold War. This raised a difficult and unavoidable question, the question of Germany. The defense of Western Europe was impossible without the participation of West Germany. Geographically, it was the front line. And in terms of manpower, a German contribution was essential to create a conventional army large enough to have any hope of slowing down a Soviet attack. The idea of rearming Germany was a bitter pill for many to swallow, especially the French. The wounds of the war were still too raw, but the logic of the Cold War was relentless. The threat from the East seemed greater than the potential threat from a new, democratic Germany integrated into a Western alliance. After much debate and negotiation, a solution was found. West Germany would be allowed to have an army, the Bundeswehr, but it would not have a general staff of its own. Its forces would be fully integrated into the NATO command structure. It would be an army that could only fight as part of the alliance. In 1955, 10 years after its total defeat, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, officially joined NATO. Lord Ismay's third point, keeping the Germans down, had been transformed. The new goal was to keep the Germans safely anchored within the democratic, defensive structure of the West. The entry of West Germany into NATO was a momentous step. It marked the end of the post-war era and the solidifying of the Cold War battle lines. For the West, it was a logical and necessary step to strengthen their defenses. For the Soviet Union, it was the ultimate provocation. Stalin had died in 1953, but his successors in the Kremlin shared his deep-seated fear of a strong Germany. They saw a rearmed West Germany, backed by American power, as a dagger pointed at the heart of their empire. Their response was swift and predictable. In 1955, just days after West Germany joined NATO, the leaders of the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania met in the capital of Poland. There, they signed their own treaty of mutual defense. It was called the Warsaw Pact. On the surface, the Warsaw Pact looked like a mirror image of NATO. It was a defensive alliance, a promise to stand together if one of them was attacked, but in reality, it was very different. NATO was an alliance of independent nations who had joined voluntarily. The Warsaw Pact was an alliance dominated by one superpower, the Soviet Union. It was less a shield for its members and more a tool for Moscow to maintain its control over Eastern Europe. This would be proven in the years to come, when Warsaw Pact tanks were used not to defend against an outside attacker, but to crush uprisings within the bloc, in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So, by the mid-1950s, the picture was complete. The Iron Curtain was no longer just a phrase. It was a militarized border stretching from the Baltic to the Adriatic. On one side stood NATO, a shield of nations pledged to defend democracy. On the other side stood the Warsaw Pact, a bloc of nations under the command of the Soviet Union. The world had been divided into two camps. The great confrontation of the Cold War would last for nearly 4 more decades. There would be moments of terrifying tension, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world held its breath and prayed that the shields would not be shattered. There would be proxy wars fought in distant lands. There would be a relentless arms race, as both sides built ever more powerful weapons. But through it all, the central promise of NATO held. The shield worked. An attack on one was considered an attack on all. And because of that promise, a major war in Europe, the war that everyone had feared in the late 1940s, never came. The peace, a tense and anxious peace, was kept. The story of the formation of NATO is the story of a world grappling with the aftermath of a terrible war. It is a story of fear and hope, of suspicion and trust. It is the story of how a group of nations, shattered by conflict, found a way to come together to build a common defense. They forged a shield, a promise in a treaty, that would shape the history of the world for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. And so, the broken garden of Europe, at least in its western half, was given the safety and the time it needed to heal, to grow strong, and to bloom once more.